It was already close to midnight when I realized I wasn't alone. The streets of Salvador were almost empty, the kind of silence you only hear when the city is asleep but still breathing. I was walking through one of those old cobblestone streets in the historic center, where the yellow streetlights cast long, trembling shadows on the walls of colorful colonial buildings. My night had started out normal. I had been out with a few friends, laughing over drinks in a small bar tucked away near the Pelourinho. But as the night wore on and people started heading home, I decided to take a shortcut. It wasn't the first time I'd walked alone at night in Salvador, but there was something different about that evening. The air felt heavier, almost sticky, and every sound seemed sharper. Halfway down a narrow street I heard it, a faint, steady rhythm of footsteps behind me. At first I thought it was nothing, maybe someone else leaving the same bar, maybe just another late-night walker heading in the same direction. But the sound didn't fade away. It stayed there, matching my pace perfectly. My skin prickled, and I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see another person. But the street behind me was empty. Just the glow of the lamps, the glisten of the wet stones underfoot, and the faint hum of the city in the distance. I shook my head, told myself I was imagining things, and kept walking. But the truth was, deep down, I already knew something was wrong. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the longer I walked, the harder it became to ignore. The footsteps were there, constant, a faint echo that matched every move I made. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down. My heartbeat began to pick up, and I could feel the sweat forming on the back of my neck, even though the night air was cool. I glanced over my shoulder again. Nothing. The street behind me stretched out, empty, disappearing into darkness where the streetlights no longer reached. I turned a corner, hoping maybe I'd see someone else walking or a shop still open, anything that would make me feel less like prey being stalked. But this street was even narrower, flanked by old stone walls and iron gates that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. Somewhere far off, I could hear the muffled sound of music, probably a bar still alive with laughter. But here, there was nothing except the crunch of my shoes on the uneven stones and that persistent shadow of sound behind me. My mind went through possibilities. Maybe it was a stray dog, maybe some drunk wandering aimlessly. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those. The rhythm was too deliberate, too human. I tested it again, stopped suddenly in my tracks, pretending to adjust my bag. The footsteps stopped too. The silence was deafening. I could almost hear my own pulse in my ears. I stayed there for a moment, staring into the darkness behind me, daring it to reveal whatever was there. But the shadows didn't move, and the air around me felt so still, it was as if the city itself was holding its breath. I stood there for several seconds, my eyes fixed on the empty stretch of cobblestone behind me, the shadows clinging stubbornly to the walls like stains that had been there for centuries. The streetlights were few and far between, and the ones that still worked flickered faintly, as if they were just barely holding on. The old colonial buildings loomed on either side, their peeling paint and shuttered windows giving the whole place a feeling of abandonment, even though I knew people still lived here. Somewhere above me, a loose shutter tapped gently against a wall with the faint push of the wind. But that wind didn't reach me, not here, where the alley felt narrow and airless, like it was keeping me in. My mind began to reach for rational explanations again, anything to calm my nerves. Maybe the footsteps were an echo of my own, bouncing off the close walls and tricking my ears. I even lifted my foot and set it down again slowly, trying to see if the sound would mimic me. But the strange thing was, it didn't. There was a gap, just enough of a delay to remind me there was someone or something behind me. My heart began to thud harder in my chest, the sound muffled under my own breath, which was starting to come quicker now. I didn't like how quiet it was here. No cars, no people, no music from the bars I'd left behind. It was as if I had stepped into a different Salvador, one that only came alive after midnight, when the regular world was asleep. I decided to keep moving, hoping that if I turned enough corners, Whoever was behind me would either get bored or give up. My sneakers scuffed against the stones as I picked up the pace, my eyes darting to every doorway and shadow along the way. Once, I thought I saw movement near a wrought iron gate, but when I focused, it was just a hanging plant swaying gently. The footsteps came again, steady, patient, never rushing, never too close, just close enough to remind me they were still there. And that was the worst part, the patience. Whoever it was didn't seem in a hurry to catch up. They were letting me know they had all the time in the world. That thought alone sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized my hands were curling into fists without me meaning to. I turned another corner, only to find the street here was even narrower, the buildings taller, blocking out most of the moonlight. For the first time that night, I felt like I might not be able to find my way out. The narrow street seemed to close in on me as I walked, the uneven cobblestones forcing me to keep my eyes half on the ground so I wouldn't trip. The buildings here were taller, their facades pressed together like silent witnesses to something they didn't want to talk about. Most of the windows were dark, but every now and then I'd pass one that glowed faintly with the dim yellow of an old lamp, the kind you'd expect to see in a photograph from decades ago. It should have felt comforting, but somehow it only made me feel more watched, as if behind every shutter there was an unseen face leaning forward just enough to catch a glimpse of me. The footsteps were still there, never gaining, never fading, an unshakable shadow made of sound. I told myself not to look back this time, that it wouldn't help, but my neck had its own ideas. I glanced over my shoulder, quick and sharp, like ripping off a bandage. Nothing. The street was empty again, and yet the sound was still in my ears, matching my heartbeat like a second pulse. I passed an old church, its front door chained shut, the stone steps covered in moss. As I moved past it, I thought I saw movement inside, just behind the cracked stained glass window, something dark shifting between the colors. I froze for a second, listening, but now the footsteps stopped too. The silence pressed in, heavy and absolute, until I could hear the faint trickle of water from a gutter and the distant hum of the ocean. Then, from somewhere behind me, the sound came again. One slow, deliberate step. My stomach tightened. I started walking faster, my shoes clicking against the stones in an uneven rhythm as I tried to outrun the dread building inside me. I didn't know where I was anymore. The shortcut I had taken had turned into a maze of alleys and side streets, none of them familiar. The smell of the sea was stronger now, mixed with the faint, sweet rot of fruit left too long in the heat. I told myself I'd turn just one more corner, then I'd find my way back to a main street. I needed to see cars, people, life. But when I made the turn, I found myself in yet another deserted lane, the streetlights here completely dead. Only the pale moonlight filtered between the rooftops, spilling across the stones like a silver river. I hesitated, knowing that going forward meant stepping deeper into darkness. Behind me, the footsteps came again, closer now, and for the first time, I thought I heard something else mixed in with them, the faint, uneven sound of breathing. I didn't want to believe it at first, but the more I listened, the more certain I became. The breathing was real. It wasn't the soft, calm kind you hear when someone is relaxed. No, this was heavier, strained, almost wet, like whoever it belonged to had been running for a long time, even though their footsteps were always steady. I swallowed hard, my throat dry despite the humid air clinging to my skin. Every instinct screamed at me to get to somewhere bright, somewhere with people, but my legs felt leaden, my body caught between the urge to run and the fear of provoking whatever was behind me. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was just another person heading in the same direction. But what kind of person would match my pace so perfectly, stop when I stopped, and follow me into streets this dark and empty? The silence between steps was worse than the steps themselves. It gave my mind time to imagine all the things that could be waiting for me if I stopped moving. I forced myself forward, scanning the buildings for signs of life. On one side, a metal gate hung crooked, leading into what looked like a courtyard swallowed by shadow. On the other, a cracked wooden door leaned slightly open, revealing only darkness inside. Every sound seemed louder now, The scrape of my shoes, the occasional drip of water, the faint rustle of paper trash shifting in the breeze. I reached the end of the lane and saw two options: a narrow staircase leading down toward the waterfront, or a sloping street that curved out of sight. The stairs were steep, their edges worn smooth by years of use, and I could see a glimmer of moonlight reflecting off the water below. But something about them felt wrong. Too quiet, too still, as if the ocean itself was holding back its waves. The curved street, on the other hand, disappeared into darkness I couldn't measure. I hesitated, listening. The footsteps paused again, then started moving forward, slow but deliberate. That was enough to make my decision. I turned toward the curved street and started walking, faster this time, my breath loud in my ears. As I rounded the bend, I caught sight of movement ahead, something small and quick darting across the road. My heart jumped, but as I focused, I realized it was just a stray cat, its eyes glowing faintly before it vanished into an alley. Relief washed over me for a moment, but it didn't last. The breathing behind me was louder now, closer, and it was joined by something else, a faint scraping sound, like fingertips trailing along the walls as they followed. That scraping sound sent a jolt through me, worse than the footsteps, worse than the breathing. It was so deliberate, so slow, like whoever or whatever was back there wanted me to know it was touching the walls as it followed, marking its path, leaving some kind of invisible trail I couldn't see but could feel in the pit of my stomach. The sound would stop for a heartbeat, then return, sometimes on my left, sometimes on my right, as if it were switching sides without ever passing me. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag, my knuckles aching, and kept my eyes fixed ahead. The street curved again, and with every step, the darkness deepened, the kind that made it hard to tell where the ground ended and the shadows began. A lone street lamp appeared in the distance, its light weak and flickering, but in that moment, it felt like salvation. I pushed myself toward it, my pace quickening, the sound of my own footsteps now a frantic counter to the calm, steady rhythm behind me. As I drew closer to the lamp, I realized it was next to a small intersection, 3 narrow streets splitting off into different directions. I hesitated in the glow, my chest rising and falling rapidly, trying to decide which way would take me closer to life, to noise, to anything that wasn't this silence. Behind me, the scraping stopped, my ears strained in the quiet, every muscle in my body coiled tight. Then slowly, the breathing began again, louder than before, as if my pursuer had stepped closer without me seeing. I forced myself to turn my head, just enough to look over my shoulder, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. At first I thought the street was empty again, but then, just beyond the reach of the lamp's light, I saw it. A shape. Human maybe, but wrong somehow, too still, too tall, its head slightly tilted to one side. It didn't move when I looked at it. It just stood there, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move at all. The figure remained motionless, but the air around it seemed to pulse, like heat waves rising from asphalt. I tore my gaze away, choosing the street that sloped gently downward, hoping gravity would give me an advantage. As I hurried away, I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, but I knew it was still behind me. I could feel it, like an invisible thread stretched taut between us, pulling me forward, pulling it closer, and then the scraping started again, echoing softly off the walls, steady, patient, and impossibly near. I reached a small open square I hadn't seen before, a quiet pocket of space surrounded by old houses and a shuttered cafe with metal chairs stacked inside. A single streetlight buzzed above me, throwing a pale circle of light on the stones, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I stopped. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, and sweat ran down my temples, even though a soft night breeze finally found me. In the light, the world looked normal again. A cat stretched on a doorstep, a torn poster flapping on a wall, a plastic bag rolling across the square like a tumbleweed. I told myself I would stand here for 1 minute, just one, then choose a path and keep moving until I reached a main avenue. But in that minute, I listened. and listening was a mistake. At first, there was nothing, just the faraway whisper of waves and the distant hum of traffic from some other part of the city. Then came the breathing, faint but certain, as if someone stood just outside the circle of light and refused to cross it. The hairs on my arms rose, and I forced myself to turn slowly, scanning the edges of the square. Between two tightly shut doors, a strip of darkness pressed like a curtain, deeper than any shadow should be. I stared into it and felt the pressure of eyes on me. "Hello," I said, my voice embarrassingly thin. No answer. The breathing faded again, swallowed by the night, and I wondered if I was losing it. To test myself, I stepped backward until my shoes touched the base of the streetlight. Then I leaned against it, metal cool against my back. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking, and opened the map app, trying to get my bearings. The blue dot hesitated, spun twice, then settled, close to the waterfront but not near any road I recognized. I considered calling a ride, but the thought of waiting here felt worse than walking. The map showed a narrow lane that cut toward a wider street 2 blocks away. 2 blocks, I whispered, like a promise I could hold in my mouth. I pocketed the phone, took one last breath, and stepped out of the light. Instantly, the square seemed to exhale, as if happy to be rid of me. The breathing returned behind me, and the soft scrape along the walls resumed, this time synchronized with my steps as perfectly as a shadow glued to my heels. The lane the map promised started between 2 chipped columns and sloped down toward the sound of water. The stones were slick here, as if the night air had condensed into a fine film that covered everything. I kept my hand on the wall to steady myself and tried to move quietly, but every footfall seemed to announce me. Part of me wanted to break into a sprint, but another part remembered how the figure had stayed calm, matching me with inhuman patience, and I was afraid that running would only invite it to close the distance. Halfway down, a window above me creaked open, and I looked up in relief, hoping to see a face, to hear someone ask if I needed help. Instead, I saw a lace curtain lift in a wind I couldn't feel, and behind it, nothing. Just a black room that swallowed the light. The window closed with the same slow care, like a lid. The breathing drew closer, louder, dragging in the thick night and pushing it out again. Without turning, I spoke into the darkness. "I see you." It came out steadier than I felt. The scraping stopped, as if the words had frozen it mid-step. I kept walking. "If you need something, say it," I added, because silence was worse than anything. A long pause followed, so heavy I thought I could touch it, and then 3 soft taps on the stones behind me. Not footsteps, knuckles. I turned. The lane was empty, but the darkness at the top of the slope had gathered into a single taller patch, its edges too clean, like a silhouette cut from night. It leaned, head tilted, curious. "Okay," I whispered, fighting the urge to bolt. "You win. I'm leaving." I took a step backward, then another, never breaking eye contact with the place where its head should have been. When I reached a bend, I turned and walked fast, counting my breaths. 10 steps later, the scraping resumed, not frantic, not angry, just closer. The lane spilled onto a wider street at last, and I almost cried from relief when I saw the glow of a traffic light down the block, red, yellow, green reflecting on smooth asphalt. A bus rumbled past, empty but real, a piece of the normal world cutting through mine. I jogged toward the intersection, shoulders tight, and risked a glance back. The lane behind me looked like any other alley, quiet, harmless. I told myself that when I reached the light, I would cross, find a cab, and be done. Then, from a doorway to my right, a shape stepped out, tall, thin, and wrong. It took one step toward me, and the temperature seemed to drop through my clothes into my bones. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The figure didn't rush. It raised an arm, and I saw fingers too long to be human uncurl and press gently against the wall, dragging down, leaving a faint, chalky line that made no sense. I stumbled back into the street, into the red glow of the light, my heart finally choosing panic over patience. Cars existed here, thank God. A beat-up hatchback turned the corner, and I waved both arms, stepping practically into its path. The driver hit the brakes and leaned on the horn, shouting something I couldn't process. "Please," I said, breathless, pointing at the doorway. The driver glanced past me, then back, confusion giving way to irritation. "You okay?" he asked, more cautious now. I nodded too fast and backed toward the passenger side, but he shook his head and drove off, shaking his hand out the window in a gesture that was half apology, half warning not to do that again. I wasn't angry. People don't see what you see when the night chooses only you. I pivoted, scanning the sidewalks for anyone else, and spotted movement across the street. A night watchman unlocking a metal shutter 2 doors down. I ran to him. "Sir, do you have a phone I can use? He turned slowly, heavy keyring in hand, and the look on his face told me everything. He was staring at something behind me, beyond me, through me. His jaw tightened, the keys stilled. "Go," he said quietly, not to me, but to the thing I refused to face. "Not here." For one wild second I thought he was playing along, humoring a frightened stranger, but then the air behind my neck grew cold and the watchman flinched just slightly, as if a draft had passed through him. He lifted his hand and made a sign I didn't recognize, something quick and practiced. The cold lifted. The watchman's eyes met mine, and he jerked his chin toward the avenue. "Keep to the lights," he said. "Don't stop." I wanted to ask 100 questions, to beg him to walk with me, but his hands were already back on the shutter and the message was clear. He would not be drawn into this. So I obeyed. I moved, staying in the glow of each street lamp as if it were a stepping stone across a river. Between pools of light the breathing would swell, and within the light it would thin to a thread, never gone, only restrained. Block by block, I made my way downhill until the smell of salt grew strong and the soft crash of waves brushed the edges of my hearing. The avenue opened into a small waterfront promenade, and I ran to the railing like a pilgrim to a shrine. The moon lay on the water like a silver path. I leaned forward, chest heaving, and closed my eyes. For 5 seconds, 10, nothing followed. Then came the taps. 3, slow, deliberate, on the stone just behind my left heel. I turned so fast I saw stars. The figure stood 10 feet away, not on the walkway, but half in a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Up close, it was worse. Its edges didn't blur with the light. They repelled it, as if the night refused to touch the outline of its body. It lifted its head, and though there was no face to read, I felt a question settle into the space between us. "Do you finally see me?" The wind rose, the sea hissed, and somewhere a buoy bell clanged a small, lonely note. "I see you," I said, and this time my voice did not shake. "And I'm not walking with you." The figure did not move. Instead, the railing under my hands grew icy, and a thin mist swirled at my ankles, curling like fingers around my shoes. I stepped sideways into brighter light and the mist loosened. The message was clear. Rules existed here, simple ones. Light held it back. Shadow invited it in. I followed the light like a map drawn for desperate people. Lamp to lamp, storefront to storefront, neon to neon. Any glow I could claim as mine became a shield. The figure tracked me along the edges, hugging the seams where darkness pooled, never crossing the hard border of brightness. Once I stumbled and fell to a knee, and instantly the cold pressed in, the breathing swelled, and the scraping began again, not from one side but both, as if the walls themselves had grown hands. I scrambled forward into the wash of a convenience store sign, and the pressure let go with a sigh. I pushed through the door and stood blinking under fluorescent glare, while the clerk stared at me like I was a mess he didn't want to handle. "You okay?" he asked finally. I nodded, then shook my head, then laughed. A strange, thin sound I couldn't stop. I bought a bottle of water because it gave me something to do with my hands. And when I stepped back outside, the street had shifted in that way night streets do, quieter, emptier, the city pretending it had always been asleep. The figure waited across the road, a notch carved into the dark. I lifted my phone and opened the ride app with clumsy fingers. A car was 3 minutes away. On the screen, the little icon crawled through the grid toward me, while my heart counted the seconds in my throat. The figure did not advance. It didn't need to. It only had to wait and breathe and scrape softly now and then to remind me that 3 minutes can be forever. When the headlights finally turned onto my block, I stepped into the shallow cone of their light, and the air around me loosened like a fist, unclenching. I climbed in and told the driver my address with a voice I barely recognized. As we pulled away, I looked back. The figure stood at the corner, perfectly still, then tilted its head as if listening to a song only it could hear. The car turned again, and the corner was gone. At home, I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat on the floor with my back against the couch until the sky softened from black to gray and the birds began. I slept with the lights on. In the morning, I told myself it was stress, shadows, echo, anything that fit inside a normal life. I went back to work. I laughed with friends. I avoided that neighborhood. Weeks passed. Then one night when the city was kind and warm again, I came home late and paused at my building's gate to fish for my keys. The street was quiet, almost friendly. Somewhere, a radio played. I found the key, slid it into the lock and froze because behind me, soft, slow, certain, came 3 taps on the stones. I didn't turn. I opened the gate, stepped inside, and shut it gently. Through the bars, the sidewalk was empty. I climbed the stairs without looking back, sat on my bed, and stared at the wall until the sun insisted on being believed. I don't walk alone at midnight anymore. Maybe nothing followed me. Maybe something did. Maybe it still does, keeping to the edges, polite as a shadow. I'm telling you this because you'll visit Salvador and you'll fall in love with the colors and the music and the ocean, and you should. Just remember the rule the night taught me. Keep to the lights. If you hear breathing behind you where no one stands, don't stop, don't speak, and don't invite it in. And if you've seen it too, if you felt it, tell me what you think was following me that night.